So today we're here with John Lanza. John Lanza is the owner and founder of the Money Mammals, providing financial education for children through books, apps, games, and movies. He's also authored a book for parents, The Art of Allowance. And this is a short, practical guide to raising money-smart, money-empowered kids. John and his program have been featured everywhere. John has been featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. He's been featured in the LA Times, and he's here now finally with us on Retire with Purpose. John, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks, Casey. I'm glad to be here. I like to see that your Art of Allowance is fully tabbed out.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I got through the Art of Allowance, and there was so much. Really, it's largely common sense. We're one of Dave Ramsey's SmartVestor pros, and the reason we were put on his program was because of our common sense approach that I just feel like we've lost touch with over the last couple of decades, maybe the last 30 years even. I think, in the investment world, it's completely changed where we've lost a lot of common sense. People want the silver bullet. They want the perfect investment. And we just need to get back to our roots that our grandparents had through the Great Depression that I learned a lot of lessons from. And I think what you had here was largely common sense to the Art of Allowance. It's just something that I think so many people just don't think about. We just need to be brought back to that every once in a while.
Yeah, and you know that as a CFP, when I talk to someone like you who's really knows finance, and so you know the details. And I think it's the details that really get to people because, if you just kind of pare things back to the basics, like, in the book, we talk about just like the basic money smart principles, saving for goals, making money smart choices, and distinguishing needs and wants. That makes it a lot easier for a parent to kind of take this on because it's not as intimidating when you start thinking about, the rule of 72, compound interest, and complex financial instruments. And I'm not a finance expert, so that stuff scares me sometimes. So that's what I want to do, and I think you hit on it. You hit it dead on, which is it is very much common sense. Mm-hmm. And that's what I want to kind of impart to parents out there.
Well, you've provided a framework for people to work from, and that's what the purpose-based retirement was all about. We need to kind of work ourselves backwards and work ourselves into the finer details. And that is, okay, you've got emergency money, you've got income money, you've got growth money for inflation, then you've got your estate plan to take care of healthcare and taxes and estate documents. And we just need to determine how much goes in each bucket. And then we finally work into those finer details of the vehicles that are most efficiently going to get us to the end goal. And I think that's, really what, spend smart and save and share has really done for even kids. So, before I just, start telling everybody about what you have going on here, I'd like to hear it from you. And I'd like to start with some questions from our fans. We get some questions prior to our interviews that we'd like to get out and make sure get answered. And I think some of them are very common sense that will get us to ultimately, I think, your goal, which is spreading the word of allowance and money smart kids. And our first question comes from Deb Johnson and Jeff and Deb Magsom. I kind of combined these two questions into one because they were really one and the same. I wanted to give them both credit for the question. And they said, is it a good idea to give your children an allowance? And I thought that was such a great opening question. So why don't we, obviously, you believe in allowances. So why don't you just share with us why you believe an allowance is such a good idea?
Yeah. The reason is that an allowance, first of all, talking about purpose-based, you have to have an allowance that has a purpose behind it. And I think the reason that people sometimes ask that question is that they don't really know what purpose to put behind an allowance. So an allowance is designed to teach your kids money smarts. And that is to get them comfortable with using money and to eventually become kind of money empowered. And what I mean by money empowered very simply is just that they learn to have control over money versus the other way around, where money is kind of having control over them. That's the long-term goal. That's not your short-term goal. So the allowance is doing just that. You set up an allowance so kids get money to practice with, because there's no way they can learn to become financially smart or money smart without actual money. And you dole it out on a weekly basis in the beginning, and you get them used to making money smart choices and used to understanding those differences between needs and wants, and starting to save for goals. So that's the purpose of setting up an allowance for your kids.
Well, I think a lot of, I think there's, in some ways, there might be a bit of a taboo for some regarding allowance, because I think especially, our audience largely being in this generation of baby boomers, they're afraid to deliver any more feelings of entitlement to the millennial generation that they already feel is there. So if we just start giving them money and they're not doing anything, they're not doing chores, then aren't we just entitling them to, well, I deserve to get that $20 a week?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And the term allowance is a loaded term, because people do sometimes think it's an allowance. It is just a giveaway. And it is a giveaway if there is no why behind it. So the why behind it is that you are teaching your kids about money. You don't have to tie it to chores, because chores teach a different lesson. The lesson behind chores is that you need to work to earn money. Great lesson. You don't have to, that's not the purpose of an allowance. And so an allowance without a purpose behind it is a giveaway, right? So for example, my parents were wonderful, but we didn't really have a consistent allowance. We started with an allowance at one point for a short period of time, and they didn't really have a sense of how that should work. And so it started and stopped and was done. And they did it out of the good of their heart. They wanted to teach me about money, but they didn't really understand how to set it up to what the framework is. And that's kind of my purpose here, is to explain to people that there is a framework. And I like that you use that word, because as you find when you deal with families or anybody when it comes to money, everybody's going to be different. Every kid's going to be different. Every parent's going to be different. There's no one size fits all plan, but there is a framework, and there are basics that you can work around. And that's what we're trying to do with this allowance setup.
Which I think is really, what you said of the art of allowance, right? It's imperfect. Everybody is different. Everybody's unique. And it's just another word for really just providing a framework. And then you work within that overall. And, what I really found interesting within your book was a discussion regarding chores and allowance. I think in a lot of families, in order for the children to be compensated, there have to be chores. I think we were kind of running into this issue even in my own family. I had already implemented part of the art of the allowance before I got to the chapter on money negativity and decoupling chores and allowance. And I know my son, he wouldn't put his clothes on in the morning, and I said, well, if you want to get your allowance next week, you'll put on your clothes.
Right.
And then I read your piece on money negativity, and I thought, wow, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So the primary reason that you don't tie chores to allowance, and we're talking about basic chores. So we're talking about, for example, putting your clothes on. If you call that, we'll call that a chore, because for a 3-year-old that can be a chore.
Yeah.
For our kids, it's emptying the dishwasher. My kids are now 15 and 12, so it's emptying the dishwasher. It is setting the table. It's cleaning the rooms. Those kind of things. We are never going to pay them for those tasks, right? That's what they do as a part of the family. And so if you set it up where you're paying them in the beginning, and then they get to the point where they're 15 and they don't necessarily need to get paid for it, then you're setting up a false choice, because they can't opt out of doing those chores. So for parents who want to teach that separate lesson, the chores, they can do it for above and beyond chores. So things that they might be paying someone else for, whether it's washing the car, or it might be some kind of yard work, then you can pay your kids for that. And then they learn that lesson, that work can yield money. But getting back to the allowance setup and the tie between chores and allowance, so that's kind of the framework. But like you said, one of the real side benefits of doing this, of decoupling the two, is that there's so much money negativity in society as it is. And I know as a parent, and this may just be my failing as a parent, but we have constant back and forth battles about doing the chores. It takes 5 minutes to empty the dishwasher. But anytime you ask for the dishwasher to be emptied, it's just a nightmare. And if it turns into this kind of tit for tat, which is if you want to get whatever money you've assigned to that task done, it's gonna be almost a nightly ritual where you are threatening to take away their money. And so, like you talked about, the more we can kind of surround positivity with money and just make it something that is just a tool. That's all it is, because we want to get to this point of money empowerment, and that really is this point where you feel comfortable and in control of your money. The more we can kind of decouple those chores and allowance, and the more we can decouple negativity and money, the better off we're going to be, because we want an open conversation with our kids about money. That's a lot of what the purpose of doing this is that by setting up an allowance with your kids from a very young age, you're setting up an ongoing conversation with them that you're going to have throughout their kind of period that they're going to grow up with you.
Well, I train now. Maybe this is a likeness or a comparison I shouldn't make. But when I was growing up, I always had animals. I was always training animals, and one of them being dogs. And I've always had a dog ever since I was a kid. And one of the ways that we train that dog is you be careful. You don't give them a treat every time they do something, right? Because then they won't do that anymore without the treat. You teach them. And dogs they love being rewarded just with a pat on the back, a scratch behind the ears, because they're helping, they're contributing, they're helping their owner, they're helping, their master. And I think, as children are growing up, well, you get to a point if they're doing the things they're supposed to be doing, making their bed, they're just contributing to the family. And that becomes in and of itself a bit of a reward. If you pay them every single time, well, then I can see, then it can easily snowball to a point where you run into a little bit of trouble when they start getting a big enough allowance, or they start getting a job. They go, well, I really don't need to do that anymore. I guess I'll go ahead and forego that $4 for next week's allowance. I'm just not going to make my bed. So,
I like that you're bringing up this incentive thing. And this is a little bit off from that particular point, but the idea that you're talking about the dogs, the same with humans. One of the, I don't know if you've read Daniel Pink's Drive, but I have, yeah. Okay, so you know about how when he talks about motivation, he says that it works that incentives work very effectively, rewards work effectively if they're not consistent. So that and this is a good thing to realize. Like, so for our kids, they have their own allowance. We don't buy a lot of things for them aside from, food to go to school and, your basics,
you keep clothes on them.
We keep them clothes, but they're actually responsible for their own clothes now, right? So they have to buy their own clothes. But that doesn't mean as a parent that you can't splurge once in a while. And the once in a while, because parents will ask me this all the time. They say, oh, there's this one time that I would, is it wrong of me to have said, oh, I'm going to buy you, or, that pair of shoes, or I'm going to buy you something when that's supposed to be their responsibility. If you do it every once in a while, it's perfectly fine. Like, that's your parent prerogative. What I'm getting at, like when we talk about our framework here, what you don't want to do is set up an allowance where they're responsible for example, clothing, and then they're just begging you for clothes and you're caving in. So on a consistent basis, that doesn't work. But once in a while, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to do as a parent. It's a wonderful thing to receive it as a kid. And so, and it works very effectively as an incentive for kids. And if it's not a consistent thing, they're going to get a lot more benefit out of it from like an emotional and happiness standpoint as well.
I've got to believe that most of the audience right now is wondering how you got your children to pay for their underwear and their socks at what you said, 12 and 15 years old. So they're literally paying for all of their clothing.
Okay, you caught me on the underwear. We will buy their underwear from most of the time, and some of the socks, but the clothes, so the way that it worked for, maybe we should talk about the basic allowance first.
Yeah, why don't you just share with everyone kind of the framework before we get too deep?
Yeah, let's do that. So The way to set up a basic allowance is you set up your 3 jars. So the 3 jars are going to be save and share and spend smart. So the save is for longer term items. And for a younger kid, those longer term items are not going to be that long. They're going to be something that's going to take, say, 2 to 4 weeks to save. Share is for charitable giving. And then spending or spend smart is for stuff that they want to buy anytime they go to the store. So the easiest way to start is $1 per week per age of the child. So your 5-year-old gets $5 per week. And the way we broke it down was, because we're a little bit lazy, is we would just give them $5 and 1 would go in the save, 1 would go in the share, and then 1 goes in the spend smart jar. And the thinking behind, or 3 go in the spend smart jar, or they can go into any of the jars. But the thinking behind it is the 1 that goes into the save jar is kind of opting them in, or kind of nudging, if you know that concept, them into this idea that they should pay themselves first. So that's what the save jar is. Then share is money that's going to charitable giving. We all kind of agree that it's a good thing for us. If you've read the book Happy Money, we realize that investing in others is a great way to use money to generate our own happiness. Yeah. And then the $3 is their kind of autonomy, the autonomous dollars. So those are the discretionary dollars that they get. So the 1 and the 1 have to go in the other jars, but the $3 can go anywhere. They have control of it. And this is really powerful for a young kid, because they can put it all in the spend money. And then when they go to the store, they can go buy whatever that is, and they can accumulate that spend smart money. Or they might be saving for a goal. They can put it in the save jar. They might be just charitably oriented, and they might put it in the share jar, but it's their money. And that's really a key part here. And parents have to get comfortable with it. And it's not easy, because they're going to make mistakes with that money, but that's kind of the point. In a low stakes environment, having them buy some things that might not be things that you agree with is kind of okay, because we're trying to get them comfortable with making smart money choices. So that's your kind of basic setup there. Mm-hmm. And with your allowance. And then one of the kind of immediate things you want to do is get them saving for a goal and pasting a picture of that goal on the jar. And the reason you want to do that, and you want it to be a short-term goal for a 5-year-old, because they'll lose track pretty quickly. You want to do that because you want to get them thinking when you're giving them the money, those $3, that, you know what, maybe I won't just put it into spend smart. I might put it into save because I can get to this goal faster. Now, it doesn't mean if a kid is putting all their money into save, that's not necessarily it's not a positive or a negative. It just is what it is. We don't want to keep them from spending their money, but if there's an opportunity to teach them about delayed gratification, why not take that opportunity?
Yeah, we're currently we set up the first save spend smart jars for our and also share for a 3.5-year-old, and I asked him what he wanted to save for, and he said he wanted to save for a lizard. And so right now we're saving for a lizard. I think so. I tried. He wanted me to draw a lizard to put on the side of the save jar, so I drew my best night likeness of a lizard, and he went up there the other day. He looked at his jar and he said. I said, "We're saving for your lizard." He said, "That's a squirrel." Yeah. And no, it's a lizard. So I think it's important, unless you're an artist, to actually go find a picture of whatever you're saving for and paste it right there, so they get that good visualization. I mean, in all seriousness, it's so important for them to be able to visualize that goal and not think that they're saving for a squirrel. They know exactly what they're saving for, and they're thinking about it. Every time they put anything into that jar, every time they have to make that decision, they're making a smart decision, right? Because they actually know what they're doing, especially at the younger ages. I think, it's difficult for them to continually keep that visualization in their brain. So we keep that jar right in front of him everywhere. Every morning he wakes up, he rolls over and it's right there. So he's thinking about it every day.
Yeah, you're doing it totally right, because that's what it's a good reference point. So when you're doling out the allowance, you can always point. You say, "Here's your 3." For him, he's probably just getting $3, $1 in each jar, right?
Well, we started with $3, and I thought, right, he wants to save for a lizard. That lizard it's probably a $20-$30 lizard.
Yeah.
And if he gets $1 a week going into his save jar,
It's a long time.
For a 3-year-old, that's a lifetime. And so we actually just say, why don't we bump it up just a little bit? So we did $6 a week, and then we do $2 in the save, $2 in the spend, and $2 in the share jar. But as I do the math, I think we just kind of have to reevaluate that every year, right? Do a little annual review as you had kind of laid out in your book.
Yeah. The other thing you can do is when it's a goal, because you've recognized, for a 3-year-old, they're going to lose track if it's going to take them, a few months to do it. You can do a matching too. And a matching.
Well, we're definitely doing matching ultimately, because he still is going to need it. He's going to need a terrarium. He's going to need food.
That's true.
But in the long term, it ends up being a great I think having a pet, right, gives them the ongoing, it always gives them something. If they want to keep that pet alive, they're going to have to continue to save in order to buy the food and everything they need to take care of it.
Yeah. And this is what's so great about it, is the lessons that you're going to be able to teach him as he goes through this process, because he's going to get the lizard, and then he's going to have to get food, and you're being smart about it, which is you're not going to make him, be responsible for all the food. You want the lizard to live, and so you'll help him out with that. But you can have him contribute some of that money to some of his spend money to the lizard, and then that's a lesson, because I was one of the people.
Then we're on creating a budget, right? That's really what you're getting at. Yeah,
and the kid, because I remember when I was a kid, we had dogs too. We don't have a dog now because my wife is allergic. But my kids definitely would have roped me into getting a dog, because I roped my parents into getting a dog, and then I didn't really train the dog, And so you're, from a very early age, making them understand that there is a mundane. I mean, pets are fantastic, but there is a part of it that's not that much fun, And although lizards, watching them eat is kind of fun.
Yeah.
But having to do it day after day is something you have to remember when you're having a pet. So it's opening up all these kind of conversations. So much of it starts with money, and the back and forth that you're going to have. I've just found the back and forth that I've had with my kids about money, and talking to other parents about the back and forth they have, is really, it's really a huge part of why you want to start this allowance process from a young age. Because, all of our kids are being exposed to money by the time they're 2, because some people will watch this and say 3-year-old allowance. And I've even said, I think 5 is a good age. That's when we start our kids. But I have no problem with 3 years old, because before they're 2, they're learning about spending. Like, they're learning about consumption. You can't escape it. Even if you keep them away from media, there's billboards. It's just out there. Yeah. And so, if nothing else, first of all, you're aware that there's only so much he's going to fully grasp of what's going on.
Absolutely. We're really struggling with the share jar right now. That's been our biggest obstacle, because we've got some landscapers. We're doing some landscaping work at our house, and he is dead set on giving that share money to his new friends that are planting new trees out in our yard. And I said, buddy, we've already paid them. I think they got paid enough. Why don't we? And it started with the church. He wanted to give it to the church. Yeah. I said, why don't we go back and revisit the church? I think, why don't we wait till Sunday? And I think that might be a better use of those funds, Yeah. But that's something it's such a great conversation that you get to have, even with a 3-year-old, where they have difficulty grasping a concept. That's how they learn, is to have adult conversations with children. I think that when you treat a toddler like a toddler, he ends up being more like a toddler when he's an adult.
Right. No, you can't. You have those conversations, just knowing they're not going to grasp the nuance of the conversation, but you're introducing them. Now your son's going to be familiar with these concepts of share and save and spend smart. He doesn't know what the heck delayed gratification is. He obviously doesn't fully understand charitable giving, but kids are naturally charitable. That's human nature, and I think it's such a great impulse to see that he wants to help these guys out on some level. I was thinking, maybe there's a way that he could, buy
get him ice cream.
Yeah, right. right.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a great impulse to reward. That seems like it'd be a great use of
Yeah.
your idea
And
is
now they get to go out and you take
yeah,
them to the store. You can count the money out, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Well, you
love that
helped me
idea.
there.
Yeah.
And now I have something to take home with me.
I
So
think you helped yourself. That was a good idea.
I have another question that came from one of our fans that I think is perfectly along those lines. Bruce Johnson asked the question, by what definition do you describe money to a toddler?
That's a good question. Well, description of money. I guess we tend to talk. So there's a term called emergent literacy that we're all familiar with. If we're not familiar with the term or the phrase emergent literacy, we're familiar with what it means, and that is, or why how it impacts us. So we read to our kids from a very young age. I mean, my kid, I was reading to her the first week. She can't
Yeah.
understand anything, but we now know emergent literacy. We now know that the building blocks for literacy come from exposure to language. The building blocks for later reading and writing come from that. So there's another term in financial literacy. It's called emergent financial literacy. So it's really exposure to these terms. So the sharing and the saving and the spending smart. So with regard to money, because I mean, I just did a podcast with another CFP, and he was saying, it's so inherently confusing, I'm sure, to your 3-year-old. Like, why is a dime smaller than a nickel and worth more? That makes absolutely no sense, right?
Right.
And so I think in terms of description of money, it's really, you want to. I don't even think so much, because kids are going to learn how to. You're gonna have conversations with them. They'll learn it in school, what money actually is in terms of the physical, thing that they are, the colors that they are and the denominations that they are. Those, I think, are less important than really just the understanding to how to use money as a tool. So getting them as soon as that you can, getting them to understand that, okay, these things are worth what they are. But what does that mean? What it means is, okay, well, this dollar is going to help you buy this particular thing, and more of these dollars is going to help you buy a lizard. And then even more of those dollars can buy your dad art lessons, so you don't accidentally get a squirrel.
Exactly.
But that's the point. So I think hopefully that kind of answers that question, because
Yeah.
one of my pet peeves with schools is that we spend so much time in the schools teaching kids about the math of money, and almost no time teaching them about the philosophy of money, which is another reason that we really have to, as parents, take this on, because it's generally not taught in the schools. And there are different rules in different states, and some school systems are doing more than other school systems. But even if a school system is teaching financial literacy itself, the only way a kid is going to learn to become money smart is with money. They have to practice with money. And so that's why, as a parent, you want to take on this role of being the person who's providing an allowance, and with a purpose, a why behind it. That why behind it is to teach them the basics of money, to understand, to use money as a tool, how it can be used, and then to teach them about the sharing and the saving and the spending smart. And then I keep harping on those basics, but the reason I harp on those basics is kind of goes back to what we talked about in the beginning, which is that money can be so intimidating because there's so much complexity around it. But it doesn't need to be intimidating, particularly for kids, because you can simplify everything down to the basics.
Absolutely. One of the quotes from your book, you had said, and this quote just really struck me. It said, "A money-empowered person knows money as a tool and uses it to craft a meaningful life." What does that mean to you?
Well, yeah, the purpose behind that statement was that I don't want people to get caught up in, this isn't about, wealth is different for different people. So this isn't about amassing any particular amount of money. And, one person is going to have a different definition of wealth than another person. But the key here is that both those people, whoever those people, they have to achieve that money empowerment, where money is doing for them what makes meaning. We're all ultimately here to live a meaningful life.
Yeah.
And so there's a great book called Victor Frankl wrote. I don't know if you've read that, called Man's Search for Meaning. And it really does get at, I mean, his obvious thesis is that that's why we're here. We're here trying to figure out kind of what it's all about, but really more than that, what we are doing here. What is our purpose?
Well, I wonder how we lose touch with that over time. Yeah, because I'm meeting with individuals that are in their 50s to 60s, either preparing for retirement, already retired, and it's gotten to a point where the conversation, for me, I want to start at the purpose. What do you want these dollars to accomplish for you during retirement? What is your retirement all about? What does retirement mean to you? And let's use these dollars as tools in order to defend against that purpose at all costs, defend that at all costs against the major risks we're going to face, and then work our way into the tools, and work our way into, the individual investments or the products or services that need to be used in order to ensure that we're protecting that. And over time, it seems like we've been conditioned that it's about the product. It's about the investment. What's going to get me the biggest rate of return? And I want to talk about stocks, or I want to talk about ETFs. I want to talk about mutual funds. And in the end, it's not about that. It's not about the tool. We might say, for instance, I hate the stock market. Well, why? And so it may be the best tool to help you keep up with inflation over the next 20 or 30 years, as you're in retirement. Or we might say, I hate annuities. Well, that's okay, but that is the only vehicle that's going to give you a guaranteed income that you can't outlive. And if you had a guaranteed income and you had inflation protection, and we did it with the most efficient tools, now you're living your purpose. I just wonder how we, over time, we must just get conditioned to forget that money is a tool to create a meaningful life. And we just start thinking about the money all the time and not what it's creating in our lives.
Yeah. It's a great question. I don't have the answer to that, but I think about it a lot, because one of the things I want to get across to kids, when I talk about products, I'm talking less about the financial products, but actual things that you purchase. And I think one of the, but what you brought up is just as relevant. What I really want them to understand, and they're not at this point of understanding yet, and this has been a process for me, is that I feel like a somewhat reformed spender, in the sense that I still, like, for example, I'm a runner, so I have a watch, and I want to upgrade my watch I want to upgrade the watch because I want to get a certain type of map on the watch. And so there's a practical side to it, and then I'll sell the current running watch that I have right now. But I realized in my research that I'm not so sure that what I'm trying to accomplish, getting the map on the watch, is really going to work for me the way that I want it to work. But then I realized I'm feeling like, oh, I really want that watch. But it's only having been around for having gone through so many purchases that I realized that I do not want to make that purchase for any other reason than the practical reason, because the excitement, because I get the same dopamine rush from a new product that everybody else does. We all do. So it's important for us to recognize that. And it works just like a drug, but just like a drug, the effect is fleeting. And so my point here is really, I want my kids to understand. So every time they get something and they get excited about it, or, for example, my younger daughter wants to get a new phone for her birthday. And I one of the points I will make, and it's not necessarily that it's going to change what her approach is or what she wants to do, is the excitement you get from that purchase is going to be fleeting. And because what happens is, and this is described in a terrific book called Stumbling on Happiness, it's just like when you get a new car. So if you look at people who have bought a new car versus people who are driving their old beat up cars, there's no happiness increase from driving the new car over the old car. And the reason is that when you get your really nice car, that now you're not comparing that car to your old car after about 2 weeks or a month or whatever it is. You're comparing that car today to that car yesterday. And when you're stuck in traffic, it's the same feeling. There's no better. You've habitualized to that to that car. And I'm using car as an example. The point is really any kind of purchase. And so, and this gets to your point about meaning, is nothing that we do with the money in terms of purchasing these things is going to lead us anywhere towards our, I like to look at it as we're kind of going towards the mountain, which is a term that I heard from a guy named Neil Gaiman, who's a writer. But he's like, anytime I feel like I'm kind of going off, he was talking about his mission, his purpose in life. And anytime I feel like I'm kind of walking off towards somewhere where I can't see the mountain, I know I have to stop, turn around, focus, and look at the mountain. And that's how I feel that same way if I get caught up in a purchase. I'm like, oh, I really would like whatever, that watch or whatever it might be. You just have to take a breath. And a good practical way of taking a breath, and we've instituted this, is this waiting period. So, if you want to buy something, as a kid starts to amass more money, for example, in their Spend Smart jar, they could suddenly be able to purchase something for $100, and it's not something that they've been saving for. But if we institute something where if it's $50 or more, they have to wait a week. And if it's $100 or more, they have to wait 2 weeks before they get it. And it's a way of, doesn't mean that they're not going to get it, but it means that at least they've put some thought into the purchase, and it's not an impulse purchase. It still might be an impulse purchase, but it's a little less of an impulse purchase. And it's, again, not to say, like, if your kid does this and they purchase something that you don't agree with after that purpose, after the time has elapsed, don't feel like you have missed the boat or that your kid is a profligate spender and there's nothing you can do, because you've gotten a message across to them that they now have a reference point for thinking about as they get older. And these are all reference points. And as a friend of mine and a guy also involved in financial literacy, guy Bill Dwight, said, because he's got kids who are now older, he's now a grandfather, he said, they're listening, they are paying attention, and they're certainly watching, and the messages do get through. So, stick with the messages.
Well, I think you're helping the children create meaning out of the purpose, out of the purchase. Is this a meaningful purchase? And then we can ultimately make the decision. I was wondering, as I read that part in the Art of Allowance, we've got a 3.5-year-old. He's got his spend jar. Last night, we're getting ready to go to a market with a little concert and food trucks. And I said, now, should I have him? He doesn't know that he can buy things yet, right? He's still learning that this is even an option. And I know when we get there, there's probably going to be the opportunity for him to buy some ice cream, or buy a soda. And so as I thought about it, I said, well, maybe we should just, fill up his wallet full of the spend money. And then when we get there, then we can have this conversation and determine if he should be spending it or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And because you're introducing him to this kind of opportunity cost and the scarcity of money, because he's going to get to a fair and be like, I want everything.
Yes.
And so I think it's a great thing for them to do. And again, he's not going to fully get it, and he might get irritated, right?
Well, I've got to say that it has become having that wallet has been so great for those things where we'll be out, we'll be at the counter at the grocery store, and he'll say, I want that. He'll want a piece of gum, or he'll want a candy bar. And I'll say, did you bring your wallet? And he looks at me and goes, no. And I said, well, then next time you bring it, you can buy it. And it goes so smooth. It's like he gets it. He's like, well, I don't have my wallet, so I can't buy it. Now, I have heard recently he'll say, well, don't you have your wallet, Dad? And yeah, but that's my wallet.
That's my wallet. Well, you're getting a key point, which is, and this works out well here because you didn't necessarily have to say no. Like, he realized.
Exactly. I didn't just have to say no. Yeah. There was reasoning behind it.
Yeah. This is why all this really pays off, is that, because in some cases, with my kids, there was a tantrum or two when we went to the store and we wouldn't buy them something that we would have bought them before they had their allowance, right? And so we had to kind of go through that tantrum. Once they go through one or two of those, you're pretty much done with the tantrums because they realize you're not going to cave. And you've already established that with them, with your son. And it's a wonderful thing. And the other real positive here is that they treat their money like it's gold versus your money. which, and they really think about their decisions. I still, even my 15-year-old is constantly negotiating with me. It's like, I want to go to Jersey Mike's. Will you pay for it for lunch for me? Because I didn't, we didn't. So the way that our food works is that we will buy the food that they can make for lunch, right? So if they play their game right, they don't have to be spending much money on it, and then they can use the money that they've budgeted for food is the food that they get out, right?
Well, I think, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, but there's still, it doesn't mean that there's not a back and forth. And yesterday I told her, I said, you know what? Yes, you can get the Jersey Mike's because I forgot to get, the food that you asked me to get that you would bring. It was easier to say yes in this case. And it was a one-time only thing. And again, that's why, like, these rules, that's why it is an art. There's an art to the allowance, because you can make decisions like that and just say, it's fine. That doesn't mean that the next time she asks, she's going to get it. As a matter of fact, it most likely means she's not going to get it.
Well, I think
be open to doing those kind of things with your kids.
Yeah. I think you wrote that leads me into a point, because you wrote the book on really a practical guide to raising money smart, money empowered children. I kind of felt like it was aimed at parents. However, I feel like it also is applicable to grandparents. Now, from a parent's perspective, I think many times we go, okay, well, we can walk through that line and say no, but is grandma going to also say no, or is she going to cave in? And now we kind of create, some animosity, and some issues that way. So how do we have that conversation as a parent with our grandparents to make sure they're following the things along the lines that we're doing? And I don't think that conversation is nearly as difficult as it typically is maybe for a grandparent that wants to have that discussion with their child about how their child, now we're trying to tell our kids how they should be raising their kids. Well, that typically doesn't go over very well. So how does that grandparent have those discussions? How do they approach this money smart topic with their child about raising a money smart grandchild?
Yeah. Well, I think, one way is to, not to be mercenary about it, but, providing them with a resource, and so one of those things can be, something like the Art of Allowance, or turning them onto a podcast like this, an interview like this to show them that, because one of the things as a parent, when you're caught up as a young parent, where money is not, like for you, it's more obvious. You're a CFP, so this is of interest to you. But for other parents, there's so much else going on. So as a grandparent, you can kind of throw this into the mix and say, here's something I saw that I think you might be interested in. So that's one. And then now the one thing about the grandparents, and this is when you're a parent and you do start a program, is the Grandparent Bill of Rights, I think, says that they have the ability to
override anything.
So they can spoil the kids, and that's fine. But I think you had mentioned, like, how do you have the conversation? I think you had mentioned the conversation from grandparent to parent. So we talked about that. I think you just kind of nicely present these things, and you can't. I don't think as a grandparent you can be overbearing about it, because you just have to understand that your kids have so much else going on. But it's worth finding a resource that you think might alert them to how important this is to start young. So that's one. But then the other way is then it's important for the parent to have the conversation with the grandparents once they've started a program. So not to say that you can't spoil the kids, because again, that's part of the Bill of Rights for grandparents. But for example, my mom got involved, and we said, here's what we're doing with our kids. We give them the 3 jars. And so she would send them a card with money, and there were 3 $5 bills, and one would say $5 on the share jar, the other $5 had save, and then the 5 had spend smart, and the kids had to put those into those jars. So you can bring your grandparents into the mix on this, and that's not to say not all grandparents are going to do that. But I think grandparents are always looking for interesting ways to contribute to their grandchildren.
Yeah, or just have fun with them. I mean, it's a great way to, have a conversation with your grandkids. And I was very blessed because I grew up with a financial advisor for a father and an elementary school for an elementary school teacher for a mom. And so they really combined forces in order to provide me with the envelope system. We didn't have jars, but we had the envelope system when I was a kid. It worked much the same way as you've laid out, here. And I think it really helped me as I was growing up. So it was easy to do that. And I know as soon as I get off of here, I'm going to order 2 more copies of Art of Allowance, and I'm going to send a copy to each of our sets of grandparents. And then that's a nice nudge, as you had kind of touched on previously.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have to shout out because sometimes I think my parents, if they watch this, they think that I think they did a bad job. Sometimes when I say they didn't set up an allowance, my parents were wonderful, and one of the great things that they did, both my dad and my mom, is that they're both very frugal, and so just their actions, the way they, because my dad always drove kind of beat up cars because he just didn't care. He realized early that it's the same way I feel. I drive an old 2002 Honda CRV, and my kids are constantly asking me to get a new car. And said, you're going to treat a new car just the same as this car, which is
right. You can't have a nice car when you have kids. You have to wait till they get out of the house, then you can have a nice car.
You treat this like a crappy couch. Why would I get a new car? But the point being that my parents really they were very frugal, and so that was a great example to set. And we try to be as frugal as we can. I think my parents were probably even more frugal. So they did a really nice job with them. And with
I think on that note, we've just lost touch with that kind of way of life that those previous generations had. I mean, you had your parents, but probably their parents grew up during the Great Depression, and they still kind of maybe had a taste of the Great Depression. They passed that on to you. And now I think this generation of children, they've experienced, they're so far from that Great Depression and that mentality that they had. I mean, now it's just credit cards, and you're always going to get rescued if something goes wrong. Right? I think we saw that through 2000 and 2003. We saw that really heavily in 2008 from the federal government stepping in and bailing everyone out. And so well, I guess we're always going to be okay. The government will always save us. And that's one of the questions we had from our fan. We had John Shadaki ask, how can a grandparent inspire grandchildren with an appreciation of capitalism when the U.S. appears to be adopting socialist norms? Now, that might be slightly off topic. However, at the same time, I think it's along these lines, right? I mean, we're talking about capitalism here, and how do we kind of get them back to those roots that our grandparents had? And that is why I named the company Howard Bailey Financial, is because Howard Weade and Ralph Bailey, they both grew up during that period of time, and they taught me a lot of these conservative common sense principles. How do we get back to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, and like we talked about, I dedicated my book to my grandfather. And certainly he was a big believer in capitalism. Also believed in the social safety net on a practical level as well. Yeah. But his two big lessons to me that took me longer to heed than it should have were live beneath your means and to understand the power of compound interest. And it's the reason why we have it up. It's right on the wall for our kids is a compound interest chart. And it's something that we make as a downloadable on our site, a compound interest chart, because it's as powerful a concept as you could possibly imagine. And it's one of the things we tell our kids on an ongoing basis. It's like, if you get your money invested from an early age, before you go to college, you start investing in something as simple as an index fund, you're going to achieve money empowerment really much sooner than we have, and certainly sooner than most of your friends. And that's going to open the world up to you. That's not to say that you're going to retire and go live on a yacht when you're 30 years old, but you will be able to do what you want to do. And that is what you ultimately want to do, is use money as a tool. And those two
To
ideas,
get your kids out of the house.
Yeah, yeah, okay. You found me out.
I figured it out now.
You did.
Well, that's one of our other questions, which I think you started on there, was about the time value of money. Bruce Johnson asked, is the time value of money interest explained? How do you explain compound interest to, I mean, I think it gets a lot easier when they can read a compound interest chart. They're 15 years old. They should be able to figure that out as it's explained and taught by you. However, how do you teach that to a younger child?
Well, you're not going to teach them about compound interest per se, but you're going to teach them about delayed gratification, and that's a big part of it. So that's why the saving in a jar with your visualization is so important, because the earlier the kids can learn delayed gratification, the better off they're going to be. And like there's that famous the marshmallow experiment that Walter Mischel did, where the kids come into they have a researcher put down a marshmallow, and they say they leave them in there for a certain amount of minutes. I forget what it was, I think 5 minutes, and they say, if you can wait here for 5 minutes, we'll give you a second marshmallow.
I do remember this.
Yeah. And so they found that the kids who could kind of distract themselves were the ones who were successful at, they wouldn't look at the marshmallow. They were the kids who just kind of ate the marshmallow. But then the kids who could distract themselves, come up with some kind of way of kind of getting through those 5 minutes, and then were rewarded with the 2 marshmallows. I think more importantly, Mischel went back and looked at those same kids when they went to college and beyond, and he found he took a few metrics and found that the kids who had displayed delayed gratification had more successful life outcomes. So higher GPAs, lower BMIs. He had a whole, I forget the list of metrics that he used. But then the key point is, can it be taught? And it can be taught. And that's what we're trying to do with these kids with the save jars, what you're doing with that 3-year-old. And that's what we start with the 5-year-old, and that's what the jar is about. So that delayed gratification is the beginning.
That's the core, right? Yeah. I mean, that's the core of what you're trying to create out of the Art of Allowance. And I think you can still incorporate this matching concept in order for them, or I like the way you explained it in the book, with kind of a 401k match, right? They're getting 4% with every single payment they put in there, where you can teach them the value of compound interest by. Yeah, and that's difficult for them to understand. But very quickly, I think after a few weeks, even with our 3-year-old, I think he's going to see how, if he puts in $1 and we put in 4 cents every time he puts in $1, he's going to see, especially when it's 4 pennies, that jar is at least going to be starting to visually fill up, so he can visually feel what compound interest is.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So they're not going to understand the exponential curve of it, but they're going to get exactly, one, saving is a good thing for me to do. 2, if I save this $1 that I could put in the spend jar, if I put it in my save jar, I get, we were doing, at the beginning, we do a quarter for every $1 that they put in the save jar. And so for a match, but you could do dollar for dollar. I mean, it's really
25% match a week is a heck of a match. I'll take that.
It is a good match. But you could make the argument that a $1 match makes sense, because you're just trying to teach them that saving is a good thing for them, And so the point is starting a matching program just makes a lot of sense.
So we've got one last question from our fans. We've got a question from Ken McIntosh, and this is a practical question. He asks, have you co-signed debt? Now, your kids are probably not at this point yet, but will you, right? So have you co-signed debt, student loans, or mortgage? I guess in your case, would you co-sign or advise someone to co-sign on debt, student loans, or mortgage with your children? And do you honestly think it will be paid back when you retire and may need it?
I have not thought about that question, so I'm not going to answer that one directly. But the one thing I will say, though, on the student debt side is so our kids are 15 and 12. They know exactly how much they have in their 529s. And we have whenever we've traveled, we'll take them to college campuses so they get a sense of how much the different campuses cost, like state school versus private school. And we were just having this conversation last night because, our 15-year-old is heading there, sooner than we might imagine. And they know that it can get out of control with the paying for college, right? So that's why we've opened up the conversation with them, and that's why they know exactly how much money that they have, so they can start making that calculation. One of the best pieces of advice that I got, I think again this was Bill Dwight, was a loan is not a bad thing to do for your kids. So I won't talk about necessarily like co-signing on debt down the road. But the example that he used, which I thought was really good, is that his kid had bought a computer, trashed the computer, and wanted him to buy another computer for him. And he said no, but he didn't have the money. He said, I'll loan you the money. And it was, he collected the interest, and the kid took much.
I loved that story. I listened to that podcast you had. John also runs a podcast, Art of Allowance, that is excellent. And that was a really good point.
It really was powerful. And I'm going to do the same thing because one of our kids wants to go on a trip to Rome next year. And we said, you are going to have to pay for at least half of that trip. And she's like, well, I can't, and so that's either going to be, she's going to have to take a job. It's probably going to be both, taking a job and taking a loan from us. And having had that conversation with Bill, I feel much more comfortable about the idea that it's a good idea. It's a good idea for a kid.
They end up getting their wages garnished,
yes,
in a sense, right? So now they get a feeling for what it's like to have a mortgage payment or what it's like to have a loan, and you didn't put them at risk, to damage their financial future by making a mistake. You said, here now, if you make a mistake, at least you're tiptoeing into this. You don't have to worry about them affecting their credit or really running into an issue, because you still are there to catch them, especially if they're 13, 14 years old. That's okay.
Right. And it's a low stakes environment. I know some parents will listen to this and say, wow, that sounds pretty harsh. Loan for your kid. Why are you doing that? And the reason that it makes sense is that they're going to eventually have to deal with a loan, almost definitely.
Inevitably.
Right? Inevitably, it's going to happen. So why not give them the experience of having gone through the process? Yeah, sure, they're paying you back, and you're a parent. As a parent, it's your prerogative also to relieve them of some debt. You could do that if you feel like they've learned the lesson and they've paid off the loan, and you feel like, okay, this is becoming the lesson's been learned. That's perfectly fine too.
Chapter 11.
Yeah. But it's the fact that it's low stakes. Like you had said, this is a chance for them. You're not going to impact their financial future at all, except most likely positively, because then they'll have some experience with something it's going to come up. This is going to come up.
Absolutely. So John, we're wrapping up here. I wanted to ask you a couple of stock questions, if I could. My first one, I think this will be interesting since your focus is on younger individuals. If you could revisit your 20-year-old self, what advice would you offer?
I should have the stock answer to that one because I've asked people. The advice would have to be buy real estate today. It would be either buy real estate today or sock money away and use that power of compound interest. And they're both basically the same thing. That was
one of the things my dad always said. He made, he was a financial advisor. However, he made the majority of his wealth in real estate. Yeah. And he always said, and this was something very unorthodox, very controversial, he would say, but he would recommend, young families, if they're in a, financially stable position and they had some excess income, go buy a lake cottage. And that puts you in a position where you are forced. It's forced savings. Maybe it doesn't make 10, 15% a year. Maybe it doesn't perform as well as the market, but now you're forced to make that mortgage payment every single month to pay off that place that you have on the water. And it's hopefully appreciating over time. Whereas you put those dollars into your 401k, you might say, you know what, I really want to buy that sports car this year. I'm going to cut back my 401k contributions a little bit. Real estate's definitely one of the ways that I see, and they say, And the majority of millionaires have been created due to real estate investing. And so there's absolutely something to be said about real estate. Maybe it's not the performance of real estate. Maybe it's just the obligation that it creates in your life.
Yeah, that's one of the things we told our kids we hope they'll do, which is to, when they go to college, and we'll see if they end up doing it. But, it's like live in the dorms for 2 years, and then, we would love to help you, buy a place that you live in and rent it out, because then you can, you can find the kids, there'll be friends of yours that will be living there, and then you're kind of starting them on that right path.
Yeah.
So
I've seen families do that and have a lot of luck with their kids kind of get the feeling for what it's like to be a landlord, and they can decide if they want to do that or not the rest of their lives. But at least they're starting to collect those rent payments, and it's pretty neat, that passive income.
Yeah.
My next question is, if there was one question, I assume I know, from New York Times to the Wall Street Journal, you've been interviewed quite a few times, and you've been asked a lot of different questions. If there was one question you could never be asked again, what would it be?
Wow. That is a good question. One question. I guess the question and this doesn't come up that much, but there are times where people will give you the snarky comments like, well, why would that doesn't sound very money smart to, get one of these things that you're talking about, whether it's the Money Mammals, the Art of Allowance. I'm going to be money smart, and I'm not going to spend my money on that. So you don't. So I guess that would be the one question I could think of.
I'll be money smart and not spend my money on the Money Mammals. Right. I got to say, the cartoons, my kid loves them. We've been watching those on repeat at our house, and they both love them. Our 3-year-old and our 1-year-old are both sitting glued to the TV. And I go, well, this is a lot better than Transformers or something along those lines. At least it's educational, and the kids enjoy it at the same time. So
right, and it's they're not expensive, and they're there to just teach kids about money.
I know. I don't even remember how I bought the family kit that had the DVD, the book, and the children's books in it. I don't even remember how much that was. Do you?
It's I should know. I think I remember it's the 30.
I was going to say it was something like $14 or $15. I don't know that it was, it wasn't breaking the bank, and I'm sure it's going to pay back, probably 1,000-fold, if not substantially more than that over their lifetime.
Yeah, it's less than $40, and you're getting if nothing else, like we talked about at the beginning, and you don't need the Money Mammals, the Art of Allowance to do this. It's the starting of the conversation that's such the key, and that's just providing a framework is what those things do. Getting the kids excited, and then providing a framework for the parents is the whole purpose behind it.
So my last question, John, and this question I've asked to thousands of people, whether it's on radio, TV, podcasts, or in person or in a live audience, and I am surprised by the wide breadth of answers that I get here. And I don't know how far you are from retirement. However, my question would be, what does retirement mean to you? In one word, if you could use one word, what would that word be?
Financial independence. That's what retirement means.
Independence.
Yeah, independence. Because, and I think financial independence is the key, because I don't have any huge desire to retire. My dad retired, and he's working more now than he did, I think, when he was working, because he was a banker, and now he wrote a book that was about his uncle's what his uncle went through in World War II, and he does talks and all of that, and he's really found meaning in doing that. So that's what I mean. That's really kind of where the meaning comes in, is that you just want that financial independence to do what is kind of your life's purpose. And I feel like I'm doing what is my life's purpose. And so that the retirement is less important than the financial independence.
Do you feel, and we can cut this out later if you want, but do you feel like are you at that point in life where you have reached financial independence and you're living your purpose-based retirement?
No, we're working towards financial independence. But the nice part is that I feel like I get to, like I said, I'm working on something that I feel like is the purpose. Like
Yeah.
if I had all the money in the world tomorrow and could retire tomorrow, I really don't think I would do much anything much different than what I'm doing right now.
Well, so when you get there, what's going to change? When you get to the point where I have enough, I could quit working tomorrow, how will you treat your life differently?
It's not going to be markedly different, because, one of the things I've done, and I talk about it in the book too, is just I've gotten as much out of teaching my kids than I think they've gotten, because there's just so much self-reflection that happens when you start really engaging with this concept and this discussion of money. When you start talking about your kids, you naturally have to kind of reflect on your own attitudes toward money. And one of the things that I've done a lot of is I've really cut back on, I have kind of a minimalist wardrobe. I live a relatively minimalist life, and I like that. It's an interesting point of conversation with my wife and I, because I went through that period where I was looking at tiny houses. She said, "We're not moving in a tiny house." I don't really want to live in a tiny house, but my interest was piqued in the sense that it's the idea behind it is very much the idea behind what the Art of Allowance as well, and what we're doing and what we've been talking about here, which is that things are not what define us. Meaning is really ultimately what defines us. And it goes back to this kind of philosophical question that you posed earlier, which is kind of, why, how have so many of us lost touch with that? And what can we do to get ourselves back in touch with that? And that's in part what I wanted to try to accomplish in the book is, we talk about the kind of framework, but we also talk about in those little asides kind of what money is, how money affects us, kind of affects our attitudes, what our attitude toward money is, and our attitude towards stuff and things and products and all of that, and how we really need, it's a good idea to just take stock of what we're doing with our money and how we can kind of use it most effectively to increase our own kind of fulfillment and happiness.
Well, John, it's been great to be able to have the opportunity to interview you and talk a little bit about these topics that for me, raising children are just, we're just at the cusp of figuring this stuff out, and it couldn't have been better timed. All of our friends are beginning to have children. And so now, people always want to ask that question. It seems like on every podcast, what is the book that you'd be giving out? What's your most gift book? And I've got to say, I think there's a good chance this will become my most gift book, at least at this point in my life. I've just got so many friends that could benefit from this information. I live it every day, being in finance, being a certified financial planner, running an independent financial planning practice. It's common sense to me. That's what I think about. However, my friends are living and working completely different lives, and it's not at the top of their mind. Even our godparents, we're going to have to get them on the train so they know what they're in for if anything ever happens to us. So thank you again for really just putting this in my life and all of our friends' lives. We're going to have the opportunity. We're going to give out a few books to everyone that visits our site, shoots us an email, and we're going to make sure we get them on the board so that they can start getting their grandchildren or children on the path to really a money-empowered state, which I know we all want our children to be at. And again, hey, if you've enjoyed the show, great information. If you've enjoyed the show, just hop on down to click on the reviews tab. And please leave us an honest review. We'd appreciate that. And that'll help us get out all of our amazing information and help create more money-empowered individuals of all ages.